In the late summer of 1976, a young woman named June Calloway walked into the St. Landry Parish County Clerk's office and quietly changed the course of her life, and a good portion of the local geography besides. She was 23 years old, with hands that were already calloused from work and eyes that held a stillness that made older men uncomfortable. They mistook it for naivete. It was, in fact, observation. Let me tell you about the man she went to see. His name was Mr. Abernathy, a man whose spine had been fused to his office chair by 3 decades of bureaucratic certainty. He was the gatekeeper antagonist of this story, though he would have just called himself a public servant. His desk was a fortress of stacked papers, and his gaze, filtered through thick bifocals, was permanently set to skeptical. When June stated her purpose, a slow smile crept onto his face, the kind of smile that doesn't reach the eyes. It was a smile of pity. "You're here for the Beaumont tract?" he asked, his voice a dry rustle of paper. He leaned back, the old chair groaning in protest. "All 86 acres of it?" June simply nodded. "Yes, sir. I understand it's for sale." Mr. Abernathy let out a short, airy chuckle. It wasn't mean-spirited, not exactly. It was the sound of a man who has seen a dozen iterations of the same folly and was resigned to witnessing another. "Honey, that land ain't for sale so much as the county is trying to get rid of it. It's been on the books since before you were born. We've tried to give it to the state for a wildlife preserve. They didn't want it. We've tried to auction it off 3 times. Nobody bid. Not a soul." He was right. The Beaumont tract was a local joke, a punchline to stories about bad investments. It wasn't land in the traditional sense. It was a sprawling, 86-acre mess of stagnant water, cypress knees, and mud that would suck a boot clean off your foot. It was a primordial soup of mosquitoes and water moccasins, punctuated by the incessant, maddening chorus of a billion frogs. It was a wetland that had forgotten its purpose, a series of shallow, disconnected ponds and swamps that flooded in the spring and baked into a cracked, stinking bog in the summer. The land was not asleep, it was sick. "The price," June said, her voice even and calm, cutting through his condescension. "What is the county asking for it?" Now, let me explain something about value. Most people, like Mr. Abernathy, see value as a fixed number on a piece of paper, a consensus reached by experts and markets. They see a tract of land and ask, what can you build on it? What can you grow on it? What can you pull out of it? Their vision is limited by the immediate and the obvious. June Calloway, however, had been taught to see things differently. She had been raised by a quiet philosopher who masqueraded as a dirt farmer. Her father, Thomas Calloway, was a man who moved through the world with a different rhythm. While other farmers were buying bigger tractors and taking on heavier debt to plant fence row to fence row, Thomas walked his land. He carried a small, leather-bound journal and a pencil. He didn't just look at his fields, he observed them. He noted the way water flowed after a hard rain, the types of weeds that grew in the low spots, the insects that congregated on the sunflowers he planted not for seed, but for the birds. He taught June that a farm was not a factory. It was a conversation. "Waste," he'd told her once, kneeling in the damp soil at the edge of a creek, "is just a failure of imagination. Everything is useful, June. You just have to be patient enough to figure out its purpose." He believed that nature was a closed loop, a perfect system of exchange where every ending was a beginning. The fallen leaf fed the soil fed the plant fed the deer, and one day the deer would feed the soil again. His ledgers were not filled with dollars and cents, but with observations. Page after page of meticulous notes on rainfall, insect life, soil temperature, and the subtle shifts in the landscape through the seasons. When her father passed, he didn't leave her much in the way of money. The farm was small, and he'd never expanded. He left her his tools, all meticulously cleaned and sharpened. And he left her his journals, a lifetime of quiet observation, bound in worn leather. This was her inheritance. It was a tangible legacy of a different kind of wisdom, a wisdom that ran contrary to everything the modern world was screaming. The world screamed for speed, for scale, for profit. The journals whispered of patience, balance, and interconnectedness. It was in those journals, in a section written 15 years prior, that June found the key. Her father had taken an interest in the worthless Beaumont tract. He had walked its perimeter, sketching maps from memory, noting the frog populations, the water levels, the sheer abundance of life that everyone else dismissed as a nuisance. He had written, "This place is not a wasteland. It is an engine for creating protein. The fuel is the sun and the water. The pistons are the algae and the aquatic plants. The product is an explosion of insect life, which in turn feeds the amphibians. It is a feast, waiting for the right guest to arrive at the table." And at the bottom of the page, a simple, declarative sentence that became June's entire plan. A body of water this rich in forage could grow the largest largemouth bass in the state of Louisiana. The frogs are not the problem. They are the solution. Let me stop and ask you something. Have you ever wagered everything on an idea no one else believed in? Not just your money, but your time, your reputation, your youth? That is what June Calloway was doing in that dusty office, standing before a man who saw her as a fool. Mr. Abernathy finally stopped his performance and named the price. It was laughably low, barely more than the cost of the paperwork to file the deed. It was the county's final, exhausted attempt to wash its hands of the property. He expected her to balk, to reconsider. Instead, she reached into her worn canvas bag and produced a cashier's check for the full amount. The money was nearly everything she had, scraped together from her inheritance and 2 years of working at a cannery, the smell of cooked tomatoes clinging to her clothes and hair. The clerk's smile vanished. He took the check, holding it by the corner as if it might be contaminated. He looked from the check to her face and back again. The certainty in his eyes wavered, replaced by a flicker of confusion. The world, for a moment, did not operate according to his ledgers. He saw no triumph in her eyes, no foolish glee. He saw only a quiet, unnerving resolve. "The land is yours, miss," he said, his voice now flat, devoid of its earlier mockery. He stamped the papers with a heavy, final thud. "Lord help you." June took the deed, folded it carefully, and placed it in her bag. "Thank you, Mr. Abernathy," she said. And she walked out, leaving the clerk alone in the silence of his office, the scent of old paper and the ghost of a question hanging in the air. The subsequent 5 years were a masterclass in patience and grueling, solitary labor. The whispers started almost immediately. The men at the feed store, the fishermen down at the boat launch, the neighboring farmers, they all had an opinion. "That Calloway girl's gone and bought the frog bog," they'd say, shaking their heads. "Poor Thomas must be rolling in his grave." They saw her out there, sometimes from the dirt road that bordered the western edge of the property, a lone figure in muddy waders, wrestling with the landscape. They saw foolishness. They saw wasted youth. Now, let me explain her strategy, because it was beautiful in its simplicity. It was a plan drawn from her father's journals. The 86 acres were not one single body of water, but a dozen or more shallow, disconnected pools and swamps. The first task was to connect them. She needed to create a single, manageable system. She bought a second-hand shovel and a wheelbarrow, and she began to dig. She dug channels by hand, her shoulders and back screaming in protest. The soil was a heavy, sucking clay that fought her every inch of the way. She didn't try to conquer the land, to bend it to her will with dynamite and bulldozers she couldn't afford. She worked with it. She followed the natural contours, the low spots her father had mapped, the paths the water wanted to take. She wasn't imposing a design. She was helping the land remember its own circulatory system. The water, murky and stagnant in its isolated prisons, began to move. Slowly at first, just a trickle, then a steady, clearing flow. The land began to breathe. Next was the food chain. Her father had called the place an engine for creating protein. She became its chief engineer. The frogs and their tadpoles were the foundation, but they needed their own fuel. She encouraged the growth of specific aquatic vegetation, pondweed and coontail, not just anywhere, but in strategic sun-drenched shallows. These plants oxygenated the water and, more importantly, provided the ideal habitat for dragonfly nymphs. Soon, the air above the water shimmered with life. The dragonflies, those iridescent jewels of the swamp, hatched in swarms. They were hunters, patrolling the air, but they were also prey. The frogs, their numbers already staggering, now had an inexhaustible buffet. The cacophony of their nightly chorus grew even louder, a booming affirmation that the engine was turning over. The land was no longer sick. It was thrumming with vitality. There was a moment of private doubt. It came in the third year. A brutal summer drought descended on Louisiana. The water levels in her newly connected ponds dropped. The channels she had dug with such effort turned to muddy trickles. The sun baked the exposed banks into cracked earth. The whispers from the road grew louder, tinged now with a grim satisfaction. "See? Told you so." Throwing good money after bad. One evening, standing on a ridge overlooking her shrinking kingdom, the doubt settled on her like a physical weight. The air was thick and still. The frog chorus was muted, anxious. She felt a profound sense of loneliness. Every muscle in her body ached. Her savings were gone. She was pouring her life into a mudhole that was now drying up. For a fleeting moment, she heard Mr. Abernathy's voice in her head, "Lord help you." She was tempted to give up, to walk away and admit defeat, to join the world of sensible people. That night, unable to sleep, she lit a lantern and opened her father's journals. She didn't look for a specific answer. She just read his words, his calm, patient observations. She read about the drought of '54, how the creek on their farm had run dry, and how he had spent his time not worrying, but reinforcing the banks and clearing out choked culverts, preparing for the water's eventual return. He had written, "Drought is the land's way of resting. It is not an end. It is an intermission. The wise farmer uses this time to prepare the stage for the next act." A sense of peace washed over her. Her father had faced this. He had not despaired. He had prepared. The next morning, she was not back in the water. She was on the banks, reinforcing the channels, planting willow saplings to stabilize the soil, deepening the central pools where the water remained. She was preparing the stage. When the autumn rains finally came, her system was ready. The water didn't just flood the land, it flowed through the pathways she had prepared, filling the deep pools, revitalizing the entire system. The land remembered, and it rewarded her faith. The frog chorus returned, louder and more triumphant than ever before. The first signs of real success were subtle. The water, once a murky brown, was becoming clearer. The circulation was working. She could see the submerged vegetation, the schools of minnows that had found their way into the system. The frog population was so dense that the banks seemed to writhe with life. The engine was running at full throttle. The feast was laid. It was time to invite the guests of honor. She took the last of her money and bought a specific strain of largemouth bass. Not just any bass, but a northern strain known for its potential for rapid growth in cool, fertile water. She didn't buy thousands. She bought a few hundred fingerlings, a carefully selected group of genetic pioneers. She released them into the central pond, watching them disappear into the green depths. And then she waited. That is the hardest part of any great endeavor. The waiting. The work was done, the theory was in motion. Now, it was up to the slow, inexorable calculus of nature. She continued her work, maintaining the channels, monitoring the water, but mostly she observed. She filled her own journals now, just as her father had. She noted the feeding patterns, the growth of the base she would occasionally glimpse, a dark flash in the shallows. Years passed. The 5 years of toil turned into 7, then 10. The girl of 23 became a woman of 33. The whispers from the community had long since faded, replaced by a kind of quiet, head-shaking acceptance of her eccentricity. She was the Frog Lady, the woman who lived alone out on the worthless Beaumont tract. They left her to her folly. The first inkling that something extraordinary was happening came not from her, but from a pair of teenage boys who had trespassed onto her property to fish. They came sprinting out of the woods, their eyes wide with a mixture of terror and awe, babbling about a monster that had snapped their line. They had hooked something so big, so powerful, it had nearly pulled the rod from their hands before breaking the 20-pound test line as if it were thread. The story became a piece of local folklore, a tall tale told at the bait shop. But then another story surfaced. A duck hunter, poling his pirogue through the morning mist, swore he saw a bass strike a fledgling grebe, swallowing it whole. He described a fish with a mouth the size of a dinner plate. The legend grew. The worthless swamp was now rumored to be home to a mythical beast. The turning point, the moment of undeniable harvest, came in the form of a man named Al Jenkins. Al was a freelance writer for a regional fishing magazine, a man who made his living chasing rumors of big fish. He heard the stories coming out of Street, Landry Parish, and, armed with a healthy dose of skepticism, he drove out to find the Frog Lady. He found June mending a fence. She was 40 years old now. The sun and the work had etched fine lines around her eyes, but the eyes themselves were the same, still, observant. She was not surprised by his visit. She had been expecting it for some time. "Ma'am," Al said, tipping his hat, "I hear some wild stories about this place." "Some stories are true," she replied, her voice as calm as the water behind her. She agreed to take him out on her small, flat-bottomed boat, not for money, but on one condition: he was to practice catch and release only. The fish were her partners, not her product. He agreed. Let me tell you, that afternoon changed Al Jenkins's life. He was a man who had fished all over the country. He had caught 10-pound bass in Florida, smallmouth in the Great Lakes. He thought he had seen it all. He was wrong. June didn't take him to a secret spot. She simply rowed him to the center of the main pond. "Cast there," she said, pointing with her chin toward a patch of lily pads. "Use this." She handed him a topwater lure that looked remarkably like a small frog. The first cast was met with an explosion of water that was so violent, Al actually yelled in surprise. The water erupted as if a cinder block had been dropped from the sky. The fish, when he finally wrestled it to the side of the boat, was unlike anything he had ever seen. It was a largemouth bass, but it was grotesquely large, with a potbelly that spoke of a rich diet and a jaw that could have swallowed a softball. They weighed it on his certified scale. 16 pounds, 4 ounces. A fish that would have been a state record had it been officially caught and killed. They caught 4 more fish that afternoon, none under 12 pounds. Al Jenkins sat in the boat, his hands trembling, his writer's mind struggling to process what he had witnessed. He looked at the water, then at the quiet woman rowing the boat. "How?" he finally asked, his voice full of awe. How is this possible? The genetics? The feed? June let the oars rest. The boat drifted in the quiet of the late afternoon. Frogs, she said simply. Dragonflies and frogs. And patience. His article, when it was published, was titled The Frog Queen of Street, Landry Parish. It was not a sensationalist piece. It was a reverent, detailed account of a perfectly balanced ecosystem, a testament to a woman who had seen a paradise where everyone else saw a swamp. He described the interconnectedness of it all, the sun, the plants, the insects, the frogs, and finally, the monstrous, magnificent base. The article was a sensation. The world came to her door. Not the locals, at first. They were still too close to their old certainties. The first to arrive were the serious trophy fishermen, men who would fly 1,000 miles and pay $1,000 for a chance at a fish of a lifetime. They came with their expensive graphite rods and their high-tech electronics, and June met them with her simple rules: catch and release only, barbless hooks, and a hefty guide fee. The money began to flow. Extraordinary sums of money, flowing into the 86 acres the county had practically given away. The worthless land was now generating more revenue per acre than the most fertile soybean field in the parish. It became a destination, a legend, which brings me to the acknowledgement scene. It happened about a year after the article came out. A dusty sedan, the kind a retired county employee might drive, pulled up her long gravel driveway. An old man got out. It was Mr. Abernathy. He was stooped now, his suit replaced by simple trousers and a worn button-down shirt. June was on her porch, oiling a reel. She watched him approach, his steps slow and deliberate on the gravel. He stopped at the bottom of the porch steps and just looked around. He saw the manicured banks, the clear, deep water of the ponds, the small, tasteful sign that read, "Calloway Guided Fishing. By appointment only." "Miss Calloway," he said. His voice was no longer dry and condescending. It was just the voice of an old man. "Mr. Abernathy," she replied, nodding. She didn't get up. She just waited. He looked at the water for a long time, as if trying to reconcile it with the image in his memory. "I was wrong," he said, the words coming out quiet and unadorned. There was no grand apology. It was something better. It was a simple, factual admission. He looked up at her, his eyes, no longer shielded by bifocals, holding a genuine, searching curiosity. "How did you know?" This was the question. This was the vindication. It wasn't about the money or the fame. It was about the knowing. "My father taught me to listen to what the land wants to be," she said, her voice soft. "Not what people want it to be. This land didn't want to be drained for pasture. It wanted to be a nursery. I just helped it along." He nodded slowly, processing this. "The county council still talks about it," he admitted with a wry, tired smile. "How they sold 86 acres of mud for a song, and now it's the most famous piece of land in the parish. It's become a lesson." "It always was a lesson," June said. "Most people just weren't ready to learn it." He extended a hand, and she stood up to shake it. His grip was frail, but his handshake was firm. It was an acknowledgement, a closing of a loop that had started in his dusty office nearly 20 years before. He got back in his car and drove away, leaving June alone with the sound of her thriving land. The narrative, of course, does not end there. It jumps forward. Let's look at the long view. Decades passed. June Calloway never married, never had children of her own. The land was her partner and her legacy. She became a quiet matriarch, a respected elder in the very community that had once dismissed her. She was no longer the frog lady. She was Miss Calloway, the woman who understood the water. The 86 acres were transformed, It was a sanctuary, a world-renowned fishery managed with a delicate, knowing hand. She never overfished it. She never commercialized it beyond her small, exclusive guide service. She turned down offers from resort developers and television producers. The value for her was not in its exploitation, but in its preservation. The land was prosperous, and she, in turn, was prosperous, owning it all free and clear, a testament to a life lived without debt and without compromise. The original worthless tract was now priceless. One cool autumn afternoon you could have seen her, now a woman with silver hair and the same still eyes, walking the banks of the main pond. With her was her grandnephew, a boy of 10 with a notebook and a pencil. She was not teaching him how to cast a line. She was teaching him how to see. She knelt down, just as her father had knelt with her all those years ago. She pointed to the water's edge. "Look," she whispered. "You see the dragonfly nymph on that stem? And you see the frog watching it? And out there, in the shadow of that log, something is watching the frog." The boy scribbled furiously in his notebook. June smiled. She reached into her canvas bag and pulled out a worn, leather-bound journal. It was her father's. She placed it in the boy's hands. "This was my inheritance," she told him. "And now it's yours. Read it. Not to find answers, but to learn how to ask the right questions." The torch was being passed. The wisdom would endure. So, let us end where we began. The men at the county office, the experts like Mr. Abernathy, looked at a piece of land and said it was worthless because it was full of frogs and bugs. They said to get rid of it, to pave it over, to force it to be something it was not. But June Calloway knew the truth. She knew that the frogs were not the problem, they were the promise. She did not get rid of the land. She kept the land. She listened to the land. And the land remembered.